Regina Washington stood before the gleaming glass doors of the Grand Palmer Hotel, her designer briefcase held firmly in one hand and her phone in the other. At 42, she had built her tech company from nothing into a billion-dollar empire, but today she wasn't thinking about business deals. She was running late for an important meeting, and this was the closest hotel to her potential client's office. The doorman barely glanced at her as she walked past, though he had been eagerly greeting other guests. Regina noticed this but didn't let it bother her. She had faced such subtle discrimination before and had learned to stay focused on her goals. The hotel lobby was a sight to behold. Crystal chandeliers hung from high ceilings, and the marble floor sparkled like diamonds under the bright lights. Well-dressed people sat in elegant chairs, and the sound of soft classical music filled the air. Regina walked confidently to the front desk, her high heels clicking against the polished floor. Thomas Whitley, the hotel manager, was speaking with a young white couple when Regina approached the desk. He smiled warmly at them as he handed over their room keys. "Enjoy your stay at the Grand Palmer," he said cheerfully. Then he turned to Regina, and his smile disappeared. "I have a reservation," Regina said professionally, pulling up the confirmation email on her phone. "Under Washington." Thomas didn't even look at his computer. "Our system is currently down," he said coldly. "We cannot verify any reservations at the moment." Regina raised an eyebrow, watching as another guest behind her was quickly checked in, apparently with no system issues. "I can show you my confirmation email," she offered, keeping her voice steady. "And I'm happy to provide my ID and credit card." "I'm afraid that won't help," Thomas replied, his voice dripping with fake politeness. "Besides, we're fully booked for the day." Just then, a young white businessman walked up to the desk next to them. Another staff member immediately helped him, and within minutes, he had a room key in his hand. No questions asked. Regina felt her chest tighten, but years of dealing with such situations had taught her to maintain her composure. "I made this reservation 2 weeks ago," she said calmly. "I have an important meeting in an hour. Surely there must be something you can do." Thomas straightened his tie and looked down at her with cold eyes. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at one of the other hotels in the city. The Grand Palmer has certain standards to maintain." The words hit Regina like a slap in the face. She looked around the lobby, noting how several guests were now watching the scene unfold. Some looked uncomfortable, others simply turned away, and a few even nodded in agreement with the manager. Regina took a deep breath. In her designer suit and carrying a briefcase that cost more than this man's monthly salary, she knew this wasn't about standards. She had built her company by turning obstacles into opportunities, and something told her this moment would be no different. "May I have your full name?" she asked Thomas quietly. "Thomas Whitley," he replied proudly, as if expecting her to complain to his superiors. "I'm the general manager of this establishment." Regina nodded slowly, taking out her business card, the one that identified her as the CEO of Washington Tech Solutions, a company worth billions. She placed it on the counter. "Mr. Whitley, thank you for making your position so clear today. You've been very educational." Thomas glanced at the card, and for a moment, his confident smile wavered. The name Washington Tech Solutions was familiar to anyone who read the business news. Regina saw the exact moment he realized his mistake, but she had already turned to leave. As she walked toward the door, Regina pulled out her phone and made a call. "Janet," she said to her assistant, "cancel my reservation at the Grand Palmer, and get me everything you can find about this hotel, ownership, finances, complaints, everything." She paused at the door, looking back at the now nervous manager. "Also, schedule a meeting with our investment team for tomorrow morning. I think I've just found our next project." The doorman who had ignored her earlier now rushed to open the door, but Regina pushed it open herself. She stepped out into the bright sunlight, a small smile playing on her lips. Soon, very soon, she would be back at the Grand Palmer Hotel, and things would be very different. The next morning, Regina sat in her spacious office on the 45th floor of the Washington Tech Building. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a perfect view of the city, including the Grand Palmer Hotel in the distance. She hadn't slept much last night, her mind busy planning her next moves. Janet, her trusted assistant for the past 8 years, walked in carrying a thick folder. "You're not going to believe what we found," she said, placing the folder on Regina's glass desk. That hotel has quite a history. Regina opened the folder and started reading. Her eyes widened with each page. 6 discrimination complaints in the last year alone, she muttered, shaking her head. All quietly settled out of court. The door opened again, and Marcus Chen, her head of research, walked in with his laptop. Boss, I've got more, he said, sitting down across from her. That hotel's finances are a mess. They're drowning in debt, and their reputation is starting to suffer. Their online reviews show a pattern. 5 stars for some guests, terrible experiences for others, especially minorities. Regina leaned back in her chair, thinking, show me who owns it. Marcus turned his laptop around. The hotel is owned by Palmer Heritage Group. Old money, very traditional. He paused, clicking through some documents. But here's the interesting part. They're desperate for investors. The pandemic hit them hard, and they never really recovered. They're trying to keep it quiet, but they're close to bankruptcy. How much would it cost to buy them out? Regina asked, her fingers drumming on the desk. Janet and Marcus exchanged surprised looks. You want to buy the hotel? Janet asked. Regina stood up and walked to the window, looking at the historic building in the distance. Not directly, she said thoughtfully. They'd never sell to me if they knew who I was. We need to be smart about this. She turned back to her team. Marcus, create 3 new shell companies. Make them look like they're owned by different investment groups. Janet, get me meetings with their board members, but through intermediaries. Let's not show our hand too early. As her team got to work, Regina's phone buzzed. It was a message from another black executive she knew, sharing his own story of discrimination at the Grand Palmer. She replied, asking if he would be willing to document his experience. Within hours, more stories started coming in. Look at this, Regina called her team back. We're not the only ones. There are dozens of successful professionals who've been turned away or mistreated. Some of them are our industry's biggest names. Marcus whistled as he read through the messages. This could be explosive if it got out. But we're not going to leak it, Regina said firmly. Not yet. We're going to do something better. She walked to the whiteboard in her office and started writing. First, we buy their debt through different companies. Then, we start acquiring shares quietly. Finally, when we have enough leverage, we take control. That could take months, Janet pointed out. Regina smiled. Good things take time, and I want this done right. She turned to her team. This isn't about revenge. This is about change. Real, lasting change. The rest of the day was a flurry of activity. Regina's legal team worked on the paperwork for the new companies. Her financial advisors analyzed the hotel's weaknesses. Her researchers dug deeper into the hotel's history, uncovering more troubling patterns. By evening, Regina had a clear picture and a solid plan. The Grand Palmer Hotel had been discriminating against people for years, hiding behind its prestigious name and powerful connections. But they had gotten sloppy, too confident in their position. Their biggest mistake was turning her away without realizing who she was and what she could do. As the sun set over the city, Regina stood at her office window one last time. That hotel's windows glittered in the distance, its elegant facade hiding its ugly truths. You know what the best part is? She said to Janet, who was gathering the day's documents. What's that? They're going to sell their hotel to the very person they rejected. And they won't even know it until it's too late. Regina smiled, but it wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of someone who knew exactly what needed to be done. Get some rest, she told her team. Tomorrow, we start changing history. Over the next month, Regina's plan moved forward like a perfectly played chess game. She sat in her office one morning, reviewing the latest reports from her team. 3 separate shell companies, Blue Ocean Investments, Summit Holdings, and Horizon Capital, were now actively buying shares in the Palmer Heritage Group. We've reached 15% ownership, Marcus announced, walking into her office with fresh coffee and new documents. They don't suspect a thing. Regina nodded, taking a sip from her own cup. And the debt? Even better news, Marcus grinned. We now own 60% of their outstanding loans through different companies. They're desperate for cash, just like we predicted. The phone on Regina's desk buzzed. Janet's voice came through the speaker. Ms. Washington, Mr. Peterson from the Palmer Heritage Group is here for his meeting. Regina straightened her jacket and smiled. Send him in. James Peterson, a gray-haired man in an expensive suit, walked into the office. He had no idea he was meeting with the woman his hotel had turned away. Regina had arranged this meeting through one of her shell companies, presenting herself as a different investor interested in the hotel. Ms. Washington, he said, shaking her hand firmly. Thank you for considering our investment opportunity. Please, sit down. Regina gestured to the chair across from her desk. Tell me about the Grand Palmer's current situation. Peterson cleared his throat nervously. Well, as you know, the hotel business has been challenging lately. We're looking for strategic partners who understand our unique position in the market. Regina raised an eyebrow. Unique position? Yes, Peterson continued. The Grand Palmer isn't just any hotel. We cater to a certain caliber of guest. We maintain very high standards. Regina kept her face neutral, though her stomach turned at the familiar coded language. And these standards have been good for business. Peterson shifted uncomfortably. Well, we've had some financial challenges, but our reputation remains strong. I see, Regina said, opening a folder on her desk. And what about these complaints I've heard about? Problems with certain guests being turned away? Peterson's face reddened slightly. Minor misunderstandings, I assure you. Nothing that affects the bigger picture. Regina stood up and walked to her window, looking down at the city. Mr. Peterson, let me be direct. Your hotel is in trouble. Your debt is mounting, your occupancy rates are falling, and your reputation, she turned to face him, isn't as strong as you think. Peterson's confident facade cracked. What exactly are you proposing? My investment group is prepared to buy a controlling interest in the Palmer Heritage Group, Regina said. We would maintain the hotel's historic character while making necessary updates to its operations. Updates? Peterson asked nervously. Modern business practices, better training, more inclusive policies. Regina sat back down. The world is changing, Mr. Peterson. The Grand Palmer needs to change with it. Peterson wiped his forehead with a handkerchief. The board might resist such changes. The board might not have a choice, Regina said quietly. Check your recent stock purchases and loan acquisitions. You might find your position weaker than you thought. As Peterson left her office an hour later, looking shaken, Janet came in with more news. The other board members have agreed to meetings next week, she reported. And we just acquired another 5% of their shares. Regina smiled. Perfect. And Thomas Whitley? Still working as manager, completely unaware of what's coming. Janet paused. Are you going to fire him when this is done? Regina thought for a moment. No, she said finally. I have something better in mind for Mr. Whitley. That evening, as Regina packed up to leave, she received a photo from Marcus. It showed Thomas Whitley turning away another well-dressed black couple from the hotel that very afternoon. Regina saved the photo in her growing file of evidence. Soon, very soon, she would show everyone at the Grand Palmer exactly how expensive their discrimination really was. But first, she had more pieces to move into place. Janet, she called out before leaving. Schedule all the board meetings for next week, and book the Grand Palmer's main conference room for the shareholders' meeting next month. The Grand Palmer? Janet asked, surprised. Are you sure? Regina smiled confidently. Of course. After all, I'm about to become their new owner. They just don't know it yet. 3 months had passed since Regina's rejection at the Grand Palmer Hotel. Today was the day everything would change. The morning sun reflected off the hotel's windows as Regina's car pulled up to the entrance. This time, she wasn't here as a guest. She was here as the new majority owner. Inside the hotel's largest conference room, the Palmer Heritage Group's board members sat nervously around a long table. None of them knew the true identity of their mystery buyer. They only knew that different investment companies had gradually bought most of their shares in debt, and now these companies were merging their interests under one leader. James Peterson stood at the front of the room, trying to calm the other board members. Ladies and gentlemen, please. I'm sure our new investor will explain everything. Thomas Whitley, a hotel manager, stood in the corner of the room. He wasn't supposed to be at this meeting, but curiosity had gotten the better of him. He wanted to know who was taking over his hotel. The room fell silent as the door opened. Janet walked in first, carrying a stack of folders. Then Marcus entered with his laptop. Finally, Regina Washington stepped into the room, wearing a perfectly tailored red business suit. Thomas Whitley's face turned pale. He recognized her immediately, the woman he had turned away 3 months ago. Several board members gasped as they realized who she was, having seen her on the covers of business magazines. "Good morning," Regina said calmly, walking to the front of the room. "For those who don't know me, I'm Regina Washington, CEO of Washington Tech Solutions." She paused, looking directly at Thomas Whitley. "Though some of you may remember me as the guest you refused to accommodate a few months ago." This is impossible," Peterson stammered. "The shares were bought by Blue Ocean, Summit Holdings, and Horizon Capital." Regina smiled. "All companies owned by my investment group." She nodded to Janet, who started distributing folders to everyone. "Inside these folders, you'll find proof of ownership. Through various purchases over the last 3 months, I now own 70% of the Palmer Heritage Group." The board members frantically flipped through their folders, their faces showing shock and disbelief. "This is outrageous." One older board member shouted, "You tricked us." "No," Regina said firmly. "I played by your rules. I used my money and business skills to acquire a struggling company. The fact that you didn't bother to look beyond the surface of those investment companies shows exactly why this hotel is failing." She walked around the table slowly. "But I'm not here for revenge. I'm here to make changes." She pressed a button, and a screen lowered from the ceiling. "Let me show you what the new Grand Palmer Hotel will look like." For the next 30 minutes, Regina outlined her plans. The hotel would undergo a complete transformation, not just in policies, but in culture. There would be new training programs, partnerships with minority-owned businesses, and community outreach initiatives. "But our traditional guests," Peterson protested weakly. "Will be welcome, just like all guests will be welcome," Regina finished for him. "The days of turning people away because of their race are over." She turned to Thomas Whitley, who looked like he wanted to disappear into the wall. "Mr. Whitley, please stay after the meeting. We need to discuss your role in the new management structure." As the shocked board members filed out of the room, many still shaking their heads in disbelief, Regina sat down at the head of the table, her table now. She looked at the empty chairs around her, thinking about all the people who had been rejected from this hotel over the years. "Janet," she called to her assistant, "start making calls. I want to invite every person who was ever turned away from this hotel to a special reopening ceremony next month." Marcus grinned as he packed up his laptop. "Should we invite the press?" Regina shook her head. "Not yet. First, we make the changes. Then, we let the results speak for themselves." As the morning sun rose higher over the city, its light streamed through the conference room windows, illuminating Regina at her new position of power. The Grand Palmer Hotel was about to learn an expensive lesson about discrimination, but more importantly, it was about to become an example of how change could transform even the most resistant institutions. Thomas Whitley still stood in his corner, waiting nervously for his meeting with his new boss, the very woman he had once turned away. After the board meeting, Regina sat alone with Thomas Whitley in the conference room. The once proud hotel manager could barely meet her eyes. His hands trembled slightly as he clutched his folder, waiting for the words that would end his career. "Do you know why I'm keeping you here, Mr. Whitley?" Regina asked, her voice calm but firm. "To fire me," he replied quietly, staring at the floor. Regina leaned back in her chair. "Look at me, Mr. Whitley." She waited until he raised his eyes. 3 months ago, you judged me by the color of my skin. Today, I could judge you by your past actions. But that would make me no better than you, wouldn't it?" Thomas blinked in surprise. This wasn't what he had expected. Instead, Regina continued, pulling out a thick file. "I'm going to show you something." She opened the file and spread dozens of letters across the table. "These are complaints from guests you've turned away over the years. Black executives, Asian tourists, Hispanic business leaders, all with confirmed reservations, all rejected with fake excuses." Thomas's face reddened with shame as he looked at the letters. I was following what I thought was hotel policy." "An unwritten policy of discrimination," Regina corrected him. "Tell me, in all your years of turning people away, did it ever make you feel good?" Thomas shook his head slowly. "No," he admitted. "But I was afraid of losing my job if I didn't." if I didn't maintain the hotel's standards. He almost choked on the last word. Regina stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the busy street below. I'm offering you a choice, Mr. Whitley. You can resign right now, walk away with a decent severance package, and find another job. She turned back to face him. Or you can stay and help me fix what's broken here. Thomas looked up, confused. Stay? But why would you want me to stay? Because you know this hotel better than anyone. You know every policy that needs to change, every staff member who needs training, and every practice that needs to end. Regina sat back down, and because sometimes the best way to fight discrimination is to transform those who once practiced it. She pushed a new document across the table. This is your new role, Director of Diversity and Inclusion Training. You'll work directly with me to reshape this hotel's culture. Every policy you once enforced, you'll help dismantle. Every person you turned away, you'll help welcome back. Thomas picked up the document with shaking hands. I don't know if I can do this, he said honestly. 3 months ago, you didn't think a black woman could be worthy of staying at this hotel, Regina replied. Today, that same woman owns it. People can change, Mr. Whitley. The question is, are you willing to try? For a long moment, Thomas sat in silence, reading the document. Finally, he looked up at Regina with tears in his eyes. Why are you giving me this chance? Because revenge is easy, Regina said softly. Transformation is harder, but it lasts longer. So, what's your answer? Thomas straightened his shoulders and, for the first time that day, met Regina's gaze directly. I'll do it, he said firmly. I want to make things right. Regina nodded and pressed the intercom. Janet, bring in the first training schedule. As Janet entered with more documents, Regina turned back to Thomas. Your first task is to personally call every person in those complaint letters, apologize, and invite them back as VIP guests for our reopening. All of them? Thomas asked, looking at the thick stack of letters. Every single one, Regina confirmed. And Mr. Whitley? Make sure they know things have changed here. That evening, as Regina prepared to leave, she passed by Thomas's office. He was still there, making calls, his voice sincere as he apologized to each person. She smiled slightly. This was just the beginning of the Grand Palmer's transformation. In her car, Regina looked back at the hotel's elegant facade. Soon, its beauty wouldn't just be on the outside. The real change was starting from within, one person at a time, starting with the very man who had once embodied its worst practices. 1 month into Regina's ownership of the Grand Palmer Hotel, changes were happening faster than anyone expected. The marble lobby that had once been a place of discrimination was now buzzing with a diverse mix of guests and new staff members. Regina walked through the front doors, noticing how the doorman now greeted every guest with the same warm smile, regardless of their appearance. Inside, she saw Thomas Whitley leading a training session in one of the conference rooms. Through the glass walls, she could see him speaking passionately to a group of employees. Ms. Washington, Janet appeared beside her with a tablet. You need to see these numbers. Regina looked at the screen and smiled. Hotel bookings had increased by 30% in just 1 month. The negative reviews had almost disappeared, replaced by glowing comments about the hotel's welcoming atmosphere and excellent service. And there's more. Janet swiped to another screen. Remember Maria Rodriguez, the Hispanic businesswoman who was turned away last year? She just booked our entire conference center for her company's international meeting. It's a $500,000 deal. Just then, Thomas hurried out of his training session to meet them. He looked different now, his previous arrogance replaced by genuine enthusiasm for his new role. Ms. Washington, he said, slightly out of breath, we just finished training the last group of existing staff, and I've interviewed 10 new candidates from diverse backgrounds for various positions. Regina nodded approvingly. How are the old staff members responding to the changes? Most are adapting well, Thomas replied. Those who couldn't accept the new policies have left, but honestly, they were the ones causing most of our problems anyway. They walked together to the hotel restaurant, which was now partnering with local minority-owned food suppliers. The menu had been expanded to include dishes from various cultures, and the new chef, a talented woman from Thailand, was already earning rave reviews. There is one small issue, Thomas said hesitantly as they sat down. Some of our traditional guests are complaining about the changes. The Petersons cancelled their annual charity gala booking. Regina stirred her coffee calmly. And how much revenue did we lose from that cancellation? About $50,000, Thomas answered. And how much did we gain from Maria Rodriguez's booking? Thomas smiled, understanding her point. 10 times that amount. Exactly, Regina said. Good business isn't about keeping the wrong customers happy. It's about welcoming all customers who appreciate our values. As they talked, a young black couple walked into the restaurant. Regina recognized the woman as a rising tech entrepreneur she'd read about. Thomas immediately stood up to greet them, personally showing them to their table, the same table he had refused to seat minority guests at just months ago. You know, Thomas said when he returned, I used to think I was protecting this hotel's reputation. Now, I realize I was destroying it. Regina watched as the restaurant filled with a diverse mix of guests. Sometimes people confuse tradition with discrimination, she said. The Grand Palmer's true tradition was always about luxury and excellent service. We're just making sure everyone can experience it. Later that afternoon, Regina visited the hotel's new training center. The walls were covered with photographs showing the hotel's history, including some difficult images of past discrimination. Below these were new photos showing the hotel's transformation, diverse staff members, happy guests, and community events. This is my favorite part of the day, Thomas said, joining her at the wall of photos. He pointed to a new addition, a picture of Regina's first rejected visit to the hotel, next to one of her as the new owner. It reminds everyone that change is possible. Regina smiled. Speaking of change, how are those calls going? To the people we're inviting back? Almost finished, Thomas replied. Most were skeptical at first, but when they heard about the changes, and my personal apology, many agreed to give us another chance. Some even shared their stories for our training program. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow through the hotel's windows, Regina took one last walk through the lobby. She overheard a guest at the front desk praising the staff's friendliness, while another family was being checked in by one of the new employees Thomas had hired. The Grand Palmer was becoming what it should have been all along, a place where luxury meant making everyone feel special, not just a select few. And it was happening not through force, but through transformation, one person and one interaction at a time. 6 months had passed since Regina took over the Grand Palmer Hotel. On this particular morning, she arrived early for a special event that made her heart swell with pride. The hotel was hosting its first ever hospitality leadership program for minority students from local colleges. As Regina walked through the lobby, she saw 30 young students, all dressed in professional attire, listening intently as Thomas Whitley spoke to them. The same man who had once turned people away because of their race was now teaching the next generation about inclusive leadership. The most important thing to remember, Thomas was saying, is that true luxury isn't about excluding people. It's about making everyone feel valued. He caught Regina's eye and smiled, knowing how far he had come from his old ways. Just then, Janet rushed up to Regina with excitement in her eyes. You won't believe who just arrived, she whispered. Regina turned to see James Peterson, the former board member who had fought hardest against her changes, walking through the front doors. He looked nervous, clutching a folder to his chest. This was the first time he had returned to the hotel since the takeover. Ms. Washington, he called out, walking towards her. May I have a moment of your time? Regina led him to a quiet corner of the lobby. What brings you here, Mr. Peterson? He opened his folder with shaking hands. I've been watching what you've done with the hotel, he began. The success, the changes, the positive press. He pulled out some papers. I own 3 other hotels in different cities. They're all struggling with the same problems the Grand Palmer used to have. I wonder if you could help me change them too. Regina studied his face, seeing genuine regret and a desire to change. Are you asking me to consult on transforming your hotels? Yes, Peterson nodded eagerly. Your success here proves that inclusion isn't just right, it's good business. My hotel's revenues are falling while the Grand Palmers are soaring. I was wrong, and I want to fix it. Before Regina could respond, a commotion at the front desk caught their attention. An elderly white couple was arguing with one of the new staff members, a young black woman named Sarah. Regina started to move towards them, but Thomas got there first. In the past, he would have immediately sided with the white guests, but now he handled things differently. Is there a problem here? He asked calmly. This girl doesn't seem to know what she's doing, the elderly man complained, emphasizing the word girl with disgust. Thomas stood straight and proud. Sarah is one of our most competent staff members, sir. She graduated top of her class in hotel management and speaks 4 languages. Now, how may we assist you today? The couple, taken aback by Thomas's professional defense of Sarah, mumbled an apology and allowed her to help them. Regina watched as Sarah handled the situation with grace, eventually getting a smile from the couple as she handed them their room keys. Turning back to Peterson, Regina made a decision. Mr. Peterson, transforming a business isn't just about new policies. It's about changing hearts and minds. Are you ready for that kind of commitment? I am, he said firmly. I've learned my lesson from watching you. Regina nodded. Then yes, we'll help. But first, I want you to sit in on today's student program. See what real change looks like from the ground up. As Peterson joined the student group, Regina walked over to Sarah at the front desk. You handled that situation beautifully, she said. Sarah beamed. I learned from the best, Ms. Washington. This hotel gave me my first real chance. Mr. Whitley says it's because you gave him a chance too. Later that afternoon, Regina stood at her usual spot by the window, watching the sunset paint the city in golden hues. The lobby below was busy with guests of all backgrounds, business travelers, tourists, locals attending events. The hotel hummed with a new energy, one that came from inclusion rather than exclusion. Thomas joined her, holding 2 cups of coffee. Who would have thought, he said, handing her a cup, that your rejection 6 months ago would lead to all this? Regina smiled. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all, it's showing people a better way. They watched as the young students practiced their hospitality skills. Peterson took notes, and Sarah confidently helped another guest. The Grand Palmer wasn't just a hotel anymore. It was becoming a model for change in the entire industry. 6 months had passed since Regina took over the Grand Palmer Hotel. On this particular morning, she arrived early for a special event that made her heart swell with pride. The hotel was hosting its first ever hospitality leadership program for minority students from local colleges. As Regina walked through the lobby, she saw 30 young students, all dressed in professional attire, listening intently as Thomas Whitley spoke to them. The same man who had once turned people away because of their race was now teaching the next generation about inclusive leadership. The most important thing to remember, Thomas was saying, is that true luxury isn't about excluding people. It's about making everyone feel valued. He caught Regina's eye and smiled, knowing how far he had come from his old ways. Just then, Janet rushed up to Regina with excitement in her eyes. You won't believe who just arrived, she whispered. Regina turned to see James Peterson, the former board member who had fought hardest against her changes, walking through the front doors. He looked nervous, clutching a folder to his chest. This was the first time he had returned to the hotel since the takeover. Ms. Washington, he called out, walking towards her. May I have a moment of your time? Regina led him to a quiet corner of the lobby. What brings you here, Mr. Peterson? He opened his folder with shaking hands. I've been watching what you've done with the hotel, he began. The success, the changes, the positive press. He pulled out some papers. I own 3 other hotels in different cities. They're all struggling with the same problems the Grand Palmer used to have. I wonder if you could help me change them too. Regina studied his face, seeing genuine regret and a desire to change. Are you asking me to consult on transforming your hotels? Yes, Peterson nodded eagerly. Your success here proves that inclusion isn't just right, it's good business. My hotel's revenues are falling while the Grand Palmers are soaring. I was wrong, and I want to fix it. Before Regina could respond, a commotion at the front desk caught their attention. An elderly white couple was arguing with one of the new staff members, a young black woman named Sarah. Regina started to move towards them, but Thomas got there first. In the past, he would have immediately sided with the white guests, but now he handled things differently. Is there a problem here? He asked calmly. This girl doesn't seem to know what she's doing, the elderly man complained, emphasizing the word girl with distaste. Thomas stood straight and proud. Sarah is one of our most competent staff members, sir. She graduated top of her class in hotel management and speaks 4 languages. Now, how may we assist you today? The couple, taken aback by Thomas's professional defense of Sarah, mumbled an apology and allowed her to help them. Regina watched as Sarah handled the situation with grace, eventually getting a smile from the couple as she handed them their room keys. Turning back to Peterson, Regina made a decision. Mr. Peterson, transforming a business isn't just about new policies. It's about changing hearts and minds. Are you ready for that kind of commitment? I am, he said firmly. I've learned my lesson from watching you. Regina nodded. Then yes, we'll help. But first, I want you to sit in on today's student program. See what real change looks like from the ground up. As Peterson joined the student group, Regina walked over to Sarah at the front desk. You handled that situation beautifully, she said. Sarah beamed. I learned from the best, Ms. Washington. This hotel gave me my first real chance. Mr. Whitley says it's because you gave him a chance too. Later that afternoon, Regina stood at her usual spot by the window, watching the sunset paint the city in golden hues. The lobby below was busy with guests of all backgrounds, business travelers, tourists, locals attending events. The hotel hummed with a new energy, one that came from inclusion rather than exclusion. Thomas joined her, holding 2 cups of coffee. Who would have thought, he said, handing her a cup, that your rejection 6 months ago would lead to all this? Regina smiled. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all, it's showing people a better way. They watched as the young students practiced their hospitality skills. Peterson took notes, and Sarah confidently helped another guest. The Grand Palmer wasn't just a hotel anymore. It was becoming a model for change in the entire industry.